There's Tom. Yo.
Well, I know it's not, but somebody said that it was here and I thought I saw it. I didn't see Robert.
And we are proud to host this panel discussion tonight. Our mission as a school fits this topic perfectly. And briefly, our mission as Wyoming Seminary is, within an exponentially changing world, Wyoming Seminary dares to teach its students to honor and strive for the true, the beautiful, and the good. Tonight, as always, for society, we seek to find the right balance of truth, of beauty, and of goodness or morality to solve the very complex problems that we face in our world today. And they only get more complex with time. So our purpose tonight here is to bring together local professionals to provide a variety and depth of perspectives and breadth of perspectives on the complex issue of Marcellus shale natural gas exploration and production. So our format tonight, how we're going to do this. This is not an audience participation format, okay?
Of course not.
I will ask the questions, and the panelists already have the questions, and I will ask one of our panelists then to respond to the questions. So we've carefully considered the questions in advance, and we've made them available to the panelists. And selected panelists, because we cover a wide range of areas here, will respond to the question. And they'll have a fixed amount of time, which I'll control, for every question that I direct their way. So the question of whether and how to exploit the resources of our planet, particularly the energy resources, is a fundamental question for all societies. We want you, the public, to hear a variety of perspectives on this issue. There is no simple answer because these are very complex issues. By listening, we hope you can make up your own mind and provide informed support for these issues. The panel members have agreed to talk to you, by the way, individually after our discussion tonight, and we will conclude by 8:30. I've got to get students back to school, so that's why we'll do it by 8:30. On behalf of myself and everyone here tonight, I want to thank Mrs. Rachel Bartron, the director at Wyoming Seminary of the Marcellus School of Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics, for organizing tonight's program. I know this became a labor of love for Rachel, and this came about from a presentation that was made as part of our STEM series last October. Our panelists tonight, just to give you an idea, we have 10. They include this: 2 representing the natural gas industry. 3 are policymakers in local and state government. 1 is from a state regulating agency. 3 are experts in science, environment, and ethics from local universities. And the 10th is a geologist and environmental consultant. Now, as I introduce each of the panel members here, I will ask them for a 20 to 30-second response to the question, what is the one thing you believe the public needs to know about natural gas drilling? And I'm going to do this in alphabetical order, so I'll start here immediately to my left with Councilwoman Eileen Cipriani, who is president of the West Wyoming Borough Council. Eileen?
Good evening, and thank you for inviting me here tonight. Good evening.
No.
Okay, good evening. Can you hear me without the microphone?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me here tonight. As you said, I'm the council president in the municipality of West Wyoming. But I'm not here tonight to represent West Wyoming. I'm here to speak more of the local perspective via my experience as an elected official and as a resident. What I would like most to get people to think about is you need to ask questions. You need to get engaged. There's a lot of issues and a lot of points of view about the natural gas industry, both positive and negative, but there are real concerns that need to be addressed. Potential health issues, safety issues, and the potential long-lasting effects on our environment. Just recently, there was an event at the PBR Partners dehydration facility, and that spurred talk of a reverse 911 system. My thought is that that's a great idea, but if people were engaged and looking at solutions, maybe we would find the solutions before we actually have the problems. So,
Thank you, Eileen. I appreciate that. Next is Colleen Connolly, who is a spokesperson, regional spokesperson for the Pennsylvania State Department of Environmental Protection. Colleen.
Thank you. I just wanted people to know that as far as gas well drilling and natural gas compressor stations, that the gas drilling industry of Pennsylvania is subjected to some of the toughest regulations in the country. AEP follows EPA standards and DEP regulations as far as well encasings going. When we have complaints, we respond to each and every complaint we receive at the Department of Environmental Protection. Whether it's an odor or a spill, we go out and we look into it. I agree with my counterpart, Eileen Cipriano. It takes communities to get involved. DEP wants to hear from you. If you have a complaint, a concern, we take them very seriously. We do subject them to serious regulations, self-monitoring, self-reporting, and we do respond to each and every complaint when we get it, and we look for cooperation from the gas companies, the drilling companies, and the residents of Northeast Pennsylvania when trying to determine if there's an issue that DEP needs to get involved in as far as gas goes. Thank you.
Thank you, Colleen. Our third panelist is William DeRosiers, who's from Media Relations, the Cabot Oil and Gas Corporation, and I'll ask you to respond to what's the one thing you believe the public needs to know about natural gas drilling.
Well, I'd like to build on what Colleen just said. The industry here in Pennsylvania takes everything from the environment to the overall production of these wells for the next 50, 60 years very serious. So we belong to a group called the Marcellus Shale Coalition, many of the operators here. And we actually self-police ourselves, and we set standards that are above and beyond many of the standards required to us by state and federal laws. And we're very proud that we've been able to implement these different standards, whether it be lining our pad sites with a particular material or recycling 100% of all of our fluids here in the Northeast. So these are just some of the things I hope to have more of an opportunity to discuss with you tonight or afterwards or in future meetings.
Thank you. Next is Kenneth Klimo, biology professor and director of the Institute on Energy and the Environment at Willis University. Ken?
All right, thank you very much. And again, I thank you for having me on this panel. Probably the one thing that, from where I sit as director of a science institute on shale gas development, investigating shale gas development, is that certainly there are a lot of questions out there about many factors, many facets of potential impacts on shale gas. And this is something I'm sure will be covered this evening. I think the one thing that everybody should know is that a lot of the questions that we have are amenable to being resolved by good science. It takes time, but the science can be done to resolve these issues. The one concern, though, is that there's nowhere near enough financial support for those of us who want to do the science to be able to do the science that we want to do. And so that's one of the things I think is missing from the discussion is, why don't we support more good science?
Thank you. Next panelist is Pennsylvania State Representative Sandra Major. Sandra is a Republican representing Susquehanna, Wayne, and Wyoming County.
Thank you, Doctor, and indeed my sincere thanks to Mrs. Bartron and also the Lewis Maslow STEM School for hosting this seminar tonight. Certainly, I gave a lot of thought to this question because there is so much that the public needs to know about the drilling of Marcellus Shale for natural gas. First of all, Marcellus Shale covers lays underneath about 2/3 of Pennsylvania and about 5,000 to 8,000 feet deep. We know geologists and scientists, after much study, have told us that there are trillions of cubic feet of natural gas in that Marcellus Shale. My constituents have told me, many of them, that their grandparents or their great-grandparents signed gas leases as long ago as 40 to 50 years. And because we did not have the technology whereby to drill that gas, nor did we have nor was it was indeed cost prohibitive that gas was not drilled. Hundreds of thousands of gas wells have been drilled in Pennsylvania since the first gas well was drilled back in 1859 in Titusville. And certainly, we know that DEP and state regulations have been in place since 1956. So as we work tonight to answer questions, to have a discussion, I look forward to working with my colleagues here to hopefully address some of the issues and certainly make the public aware and understand much about the Marcellus Shale natural gas drilling. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Next panelist is Pennsylvania State Representative Phyllis Mundy, a Democrat representing Luzerne County. Phyllis?
Good evening and welcome to my legislative district. What I think that people should know about Marcellus Shale gas drilling in Pennsylvania is that your state government has not and is not doing all that we can to protect the environment and public health and safety. And I believe that the Marcellus Shale industry and its drilling has far outpaced state and federal law and regulations and our scientific knowledge and understanding of the impacts both short and long term. So I hope that we will be able to get into some of the reasons why I feel that way. 30 seconds really doesn't really much time to dig deep.
Our next panelist is Brian Oren, who is a professional geologist and a consultant with BF Environmental Consultants. Brian?
Hello. I'm going to take a little different spin. I think the thing we need to know about natural gas drilling is that it's another form of energy. And the people, all of us in this room are the consumers of that energy. And we all have the ability to make a choice on how we might want to change our lives or live our lives. And if we want to sign a lease or don't sign a lease, or make a change and use less energy. Again, our country, we waste, of all the energy we produce, we waste 54% of that energy. So, of the 40%, 47% that's left, that's the energy we actually rely on. But over half of it goes away. If you want to make a difference, conserve. That's a big start. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Bernard Prusa, Director of the McGowan Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility at King's College.
I thought we had 3 to 5 minutes. 30 seconds?
This is just the opening. This is the opening.
Brief. 5 minutes prepared. Did I take 5 minutes? So many people haven't spoken very long, so thank you for inviting me. The question for me was, what's the special contribution of a moral philosopher or an ethicist, which I am, to this discussion? What's the one thing that somebody like me has to say as a professional to the public? And that, I think, is this, that in conditions of uncertainty, when a course of action poses a moral risk, that's to say a risk to morally important interests, first, there are special demands on the would-be actors to try to dispel the uncertainty. And second, if some uncertainty remains, there are criteria that need to be met before the action in question should be permitted. So, fracking does or does not satisfy these criteria, but I want to use my little bit of time to speak to these special demands on would-be actors, and also to indicate what these criteria are that need to be met before an action, such as perhaps fracking, could be considered morally permissible. So briefly, this isn't about fracking immediately. Briefly, take 2 simple cases, which I've taken from a philosopher at Penn named Alexander Guerrero. There is in town a rundown house that appears to be abandoned. So Jack, case 1, is a census worker trying to determine whether there is anyone living in the house before he submits his count. Jill, case 2, is a construction worker trying to determine whether there is anyone living in the house before she demolishes it. Jill has greater so-called epistemic obligations than Jack does, which is to say obligations to get things right. In other words, she has to do more investigating than he does before she has an actionable claim to know that there is no one living in the house. If he gets it wrong, there's not all that much in the balance. If she gets it wrong, there's a lot in the balance. The reason is that the action that her belief will be used to justify is quite morally serious because significant harm or even death is at stake. The question here that's relevant to fracking is whether, and it's a question, I'm not saying I've got the answer to it, this is a question that as an ethicist I can help to clarify. The question that's relevant to fracking is whether the gas companies and our government have done enough and have sufficient evidence to rule out the risks to health, human health and the environment that, if they obtain, should block fracking. Now, second case. Let's say that Jill undertakes a thorough and careful investigation, but some uncertainty remains. That is, she still does not know with certainty that her action poses no morally significant risks. When could she be permitted to proceed? The answer is that she would need reason to believe that there are considerations of substantial moral significance compelling her to action. In brief, she would need morality on her side. Otherwise, she can't justify running the risk of significant harm or death. So and I'm almost finished. I haven't seen the red card quite yet. I want to draw out the three criteria that need to be met. We're talking about how could you justify action in cases of uncertainty. So first I talked about the special demands and would-be actors when there is uncertainty. You've got a very high threshold that you need to meet in order to try to dispel that uncertainty. Let's say that some uncertainty remains. What are the criteria that would permit you going ahead with the action in question? All right? So there are three criteria. First, the considerations must be moral, meaning concern with prevention of harm or death, the protection of rights, or the advancement of human well-being. And saving or making money would not count here. So Jill can't justify demolishing the house because it would save some money for the construction company, obviously, because she can't run that risk. She's got to have some moral consideration on her side. Second, these moral considerations must be substantial, meaning of great importance. The prevention of minor harms or harms that could be averted in some other way would not count here. And third, these substantial moral considerations must be compelling, meaning making it appear necessary for her to go ahead with the action that she has in mind. So she's got to have moral considerations on her side. She's acting in a case of uncertainty. They've got to be substantial moral considerations. And finally, they have to be found compelling. The second question relevant to fracking then is whether, if uncertainty remains, I'm not speaking to whether it does or does not, over its risks, there are in its support considerations of substantial moral significance that the public should find compelling.
We are going to have time for longer responses. This is really just an introduction. But thank you. I appreciate that. Next panelist is Rory Sweeney with Media Relations from the Chesapeake Energy Corporation. Rory?
Hello, everyone. It's working. And I'll stick to the original introduction here. And the question, if I remember, is what's the most important thing that you should take away from this? And from my standpoint, it's a homegrown resource. This is something that was produced here in Pennsylvania by Pennsylvanians for Pennsylvanians. It is a world-class gas field right within hours of one of the largest gas consumption markets in the world. It's under world-class oversight, some of the best in the country. And you know, we all know from gasoline prices that transportation has costs. It costs money, it costs energy, it can waste energy. When we have a product this prolific, this close to the market, we're saving all of ourselves a lot of money and a lot of energy. You know, I have an environmental background, and having talked to a lot of people, you always hear we want to think globally but act locally. People will go to their local farmers markets for food and want to buy local products. but we should also be thinking that same way when it comes to our energy choices. And the Marcellus Shale being right here in our communities is the #1 choice for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rory. And last, only alphabetically, Marlene Troy, Associate Professor of Environmental Engineering in the Department of Environmental Engineering and Earth Science at Wilkes University. Marlene.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I want to start out with a quote that I quite often use when I'm teaching, and it says, "We can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them." And it's by Albert Einstein. And I would like to concur with what my colleagues were saying. I think there's a lot of challenges, but I think we have to think more big picture. Gas drilling is important, but how does it fit into our overall energy policy? Like Brian had mentioned, I think there's a lot of issues with how we use our energy. Are we using it smartly? And also, as Dr. Klimo had said, how are we getting the information we need to make good decisions? So I think there's a lot of opportunities for discussions. I think we also have to be big picture thinking. And how does gas drilling fit into the big picture of all our energy challenges? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. You now know who our panelists are this evening. And
Well, I guess you decided to give me the easy one. The easy answer is no, obviously not. We haven't addressed, when I say we, I consider myself a we when they talk about my profession and what I hope to do. We haven't addressed those because there's been a long history of poor messaging from PR companies, poor messaging from gas companies explaining themselves. And again, poor messaging from the top government. A lot of information about groundwater quality in Pennsylvania wasn't known to the public, but it was known to a bunch of people that read scientific journals, and nobody told you guys. And I think that's part of the problem. So on that side, no, we haven't done enough. And I think the other thing, what we really need is education on energy. I mean, we're all players in this. And this is something that, in my opinion, is not a side. And for me, there's no sides to this issue. There is this issue, and it's energy. Where are we going to get it? How are we going to use it? How are we going to move forward and leave a place for our kids? So, on the environmental social side, I think these are the things we have to solve as a community. In my talk, that's one of my big buzzwords, is working as a community. And the other buzzword is we all live downstream. Whatever activity happens upstream of us, will flow downhill. The economic impacts, that's not my place to judge. I do know that from the consulting side, I do not have any master service agreements or contracts with gas companies. That's a decision I made about 3 years ago. I will guarantee you, though, the consulting companies that do have those contracts would not be in business in today's economy if it wasn't for those. That's only one part of the economic side, and I think that's the best I can offer.
thank you, Brian. We'll go to question 1 next for a response from Eileen Cipriani. Eileen.
I also agree with Brian. I don't believe the local concerns have been adequately addressed. Local residents have concern about emissions, about their water. It's the safety of their water. That's something that's very relevant to everyone, and there's not been a lot of research that could lead them to any conclusion on that. I look at this as analogous to the FDA releasing a medication and allowing it to be on the market for 2 years and then going back and seeing if it's safe. The research needs to be done in order for us to make any kind of judgment about our health and our environment. On the economic side, the state instituted an impact fee. Well, the impact fee, if you know how it goes, that where there's active drilling, the impact fee is put into place. So there are counties that are receiving a lot of money, but in Luzerne County, they receive very little because there's no active drill wells in this county. Local residents that I've talked to feel that a tax on the gas industry would be a far better solution to this. It would provide a new source of revenue to the state of Pennsylvania and maybe help fund education, which ends up being in our own local property taxes when it's not properly funded by the state. As far as social issues, this issue divides people in the neighborhood. Much of this drilling is done in close proximity to homes and businesses. It divides neighbors. One neighbor may be receiving financial benefit from the industry, while the other still has the effect of the harmful impacts possibly, but they're not getting any financial gain. And the one last one that wasn't in here is public safety. That to me is one of the primary concerns. That needs to be dealt with in the gas industry, and the county EMA and local responders need to be coordinated together and need to have a plan in place to guard with the public safety.
Thank you. Hey, Colleen Conlon, would you respond also to question number 1?
As far as have the local concerns been sufficiently addressed, environmentally, socially, and economically, I can speak mostly for environmentally, but environmentally, I would say we're getting there, and we're getting there to the answer of yes. Here at the DEP, we regulate the gas industry, we issue the permits, we respond to complaints. Already we have at least 2 water contamination complaints that we're investigating in Susquehanna County, as your Representative can attest to. It's in Franklin Forks. We're looking into that. It's taken more than 8 months to investigate that. We're doing a solid, thorough job to rely on sampling science. We have some air quality compressor stations that we've had some issues with over the past couple of months, as Lisa Brianna can attest to, the residents. We're looking into those complaints also. We're getting there. We can only respond as a regulatory agency when you, the public, get involved and tell us, hey, this is wrong, that's wrong, can you please do something about it? Will we move in a manner, in a timely fashion that you want us to? Maybe a little slower than we like, but we're really trying to get those answers for you. You can come to the DEP, you call the DEP, and you need an answer to your question. We can only answer those questions and know about the problems if we hear from the public. Socially, economically, I can say the DEP would absolutely support a study by the local chambers of commerce of what the economic impact is. We absolutely would. I know there are some studies being done right now, but we'd like a broad-based study that the DEP can contribute to. Socially, that's a question for the local police departments. I believe as to whether or not there are social problems. Do we have some social issues? Sure. We have some groups that really look into and keep an eye on the gas industry. They're represented here tonight. We like to hear from them also. Do we agree all the time? No, we don't. But I think it's a process that we're working towards to try and solve the environmental, economic, and social impacts. When it comes right down to what we hear from the public is the only thing the DEP can do to rely on solid information to get out and know about the problem.
Thank you. I actually have some extra time on this question. Is there another panelist who'd like to respond to question number 1? Okay, we'll move on to question number 2 then. What technological advancements or industry best practices should the public know about? How can these advancements alleviate concerns of local residents? And let's start this response with Rory Sweeney.
Sure. I think there are, from my perspective, 3 major things, advancements that the industry can tout here in PA. Number 1 being casing design. And I know Bill will probably talk about a few other ones, but the casing design has been enhanced in this region based completely on information that we found out through activity in the region. We went from a 2-string design to only 2 sleeves of steel up to a 3-string design, specifically to address some shallow geology issues that were previously not very well known in this region, which kind of brings me to my second point. You know, a lot of what the industry activity up here in northern Pennsylvania is doing is explaining a lot more about the geology than we previously knew. There was a lot of old research that hadn't seen the light of day in a while, and with the industry focus on this area, it's become more interesting, and more people have studied it, and that's been a positive impact for the region, that we're learning more and more about the area. And the third thing that I would say is in particular, is precise horizontal drilling. I know the term hydraulic fracturing comes up, and people think that's the new technology. That's been around for decades. It's really the precise horizontal drilling, the ability to drill 1.5 miles into the ground and then 1 mile laterally out and hit a 20-foot bullseye and know that you're there. That has made this, has opened up these shale plays and allowed companies like mine to continue to get a return on their investment. And one of the things that we have down in Oklahoma is what we call our 3D viz room. You can actually visualize the shale in there, and they can go and see the stratigraphy of the geology and figure out where it ripples and how we would need to drill this well. So that there are hundreds, sometimes thousands of people who have worked on this well, been in the theory, looked at it theoretically before we've actually ever touched the ground, moved any earth. And when you add to that the seismic data that comes in that's used with the 3D viz room, there's a lot of professionalism that goes into designing each one of these wells and designing the hydraulic fracture and the well completion prior to anyone even stepping onto the pad site. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to ask Bill DeRosiers to respond to that question, please.
This was perhaps my most intriguing question, and I can spend the next hour and a half talking about all of the great technology advances that we've been implementing here, specifically in the Marcellus Shale. For instance, we have new rigs that are coming into the area that are designed to walk in these locations, which have cut down our drilling time dramatically from 40 days to 16. And what that means is we do not have to take apart the rigs and use energy to take apart these rigs and waste time moving them. We have the ability to simply walk the rig. And I'm going to really stress walk. It's not a very fast process, but from well to well. But perhaps the most important thing, especially when local residents should be alleviated by, is the best practices that we voluntarily implement throughout our operations. I touched on it briefly right at the beginning during our quick introductions, but one of the things Cabot is very proud of, not only itself but the industry, is 100% recycle and reusing of all the fluids we use, not only during hydraulic fracturing, but the drilling process and the production process. It's an amazing setup that we have. All the fluid is captured in steel tanks, brought to a facility called Comtech, where we use chemical precipitation to essentially take out all the undissolved solids in the water. And then that water is reused in future hydraulic fracturing operations. To date, we've saved 30% of our freshwater demand. We've cut down on 18,000 truck trips to freshwater withdrawal points this year alone, some of which could be half an hour to 45 minutes away. So if you want to do the math, how much diesel fuel and how much time on roads and road degradation we've saved, it's an amazing accomplishment. We're looking to increase that tenfold. Getting back to technology, oftentimes people ask, where are the fractures going? Are they going out of the formation? The last thing we want is those fractures to leave the formation, because that's not where the gas is. But some of the ways that we know where the fractures are going is we actually have, through technology, the ability to watch those fractures real time. The sensors have increased, the real-time computing has increased. So not only on the surface do we know how much fluid are we pumping, what's our mix, and what's our rate of fracturing down there. We have people in Houston and Pittsburgh who are watching this real time to make sure it's going to what their specifications are. We even have the ability to put down what they call geophones into existing wells to watch these fractures happening real time. And we can map them out digitally so that we can study this in locations like Rory was discussing, or in places like Houston, Pittsburgh universities, to effectively design new fracturing methodology. One of the big things that Cabot is constantly looking is how can we get more out of the ground with doing less? And what we're proud of in Susquehanna County, we have 200 wells that are producing 1 billion cubic feet of gas a day. That's enough to power 25,000 homes for a whole year. We're doing that in a day. We have 30 years worth of drilling in West Virginia. That's 3,000 wells producing roughly 30 million cubic feet of gas a day. So when you get down to the math and the numbers, what we can do today in the Marcellus Shale, how much we can produce, the technology we're doing or using to effectively produce that, and then the best practices we employ to protect the environment is truly amazing. And I can't wait to see in 10 years from now what the industry can accomplish in this area. Thank you.
How many more
Thank you,
minutes you
Bill.
need?
Appreciate it. Lastly, on question number 2, I'd like Ken Clemo to respond, please.
Oh my goodness, okay. Thought I deferred on this one, but,
Yeah, we'll make you talk about it anyway.
all right. So the, if I can admit to something, that is, I know when we were talking about the development of this forum with Rachel, this is actually the one question that I thought, might be the most interesting question to ask the panelists, and whether in fact this would be a good question to actually center this discussion around. And pretty much the reason why I thought this was an intriguing question, because I think there is a disconnect between what the industry is doing and maybe what the industry thinks they're doing versus what everybody else, especially the critics of drilling, think that the industry is maybe not doing. That there's, again, this disconnect, and I thought that this would be an important question to address. Probably what really brought this home to me is back in the fall, I actually had a discussion with somebody from Penn Environment. And Penn Environment is a different organization from Penn Future. And they issued a report. Some of you might remember they actually came up here, I think it was in October, and had a presentation of one of their studies that they had done, or one of their papers they prepared. And in the discussion with the person from Penn Environment about this, I mentioned, I read through their paper, and I thought that it was pretty one-sided. And, the one question that I asked of the person was, well, one of the things you're not doing is you're not really giving industry enough credit for, some of the advances that they have. And the response was that industry is doing nothing. They have had no advancements whatsoever. And that really indicated a severe disconnect, again, between industry's perception of what they're doing and how other people perceive how they're doing. So, again, I think, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's important that we try to get on the same page and we actually hear what each other is saying and maybe try not to be so inflexible in our opinions. But I'll say more about that later on.
Good, thank you very much. Appreciate you taking that anyway. That surprised you. Okay, let's move on to question number 3. What kind of regulations help to govern both the infrastructure, road maintenance, long-term monitoring of wells and pipelines, as well as the economic impacts, including appropriate taxation and distribution of these taxes? And we'll start that with our regulator, Colleen Conley.
Thank you. Well, as I said before, DEP, we're the agency that regulates the natural gas industry. Natural gas companies cannot drill unless we tell them they can drill. We should have a permit. If there's a problem, we can yank that permit, or we can cite, or we can find them. What type of regulations exist with the infrastructure as far as maintenance, long-term monitoring? It is self-monitoring, but we do subject the gas companies to unannounced visits to make sure they are following the rules and regulations of their permit. We do subject the natural gas compressor stations to supervised visits as to what they're doing, are they following the regulations, and so that happens. We do rely on self-monitoring. That's how it goes in the state of Pennsylvania. We get our cue from Harrisburg. Harrisburg tells us, sets the laws that we can find in the rules and regulations that we tell the gas companies they have to follow. Maintenance, we do look at gas companies with their trucks. Are they spilling a lot of dirt on the highway? Are they air quality issues with what they're hauling from the fracking material from the trucks? We subject them to clean air policies, making sure that they are following the rules and regulations of that. Long-term monitoring, we're trying to get into a long-term study. We're working with Harrisburg to do a long-term study on the impacts of natural gas in the state of Pennsylvania. We already have a long-term study on compressor stations, an air quality study as to air quality compressor stations. Are they impacting society? How much methane are they releasing into the atmosphere? All in that study. Pipelines are pretty much regulated by FERC, which is the Federal Regulatory Commission. They regulate the pipelines. DEP issues the permits whether or not someone can do work. We protect the wetlands, the streams. If we feel a gas company is going to do do long-term damage to a wetland or a stream, we won't issue that permit. If we feel they have a plan that can actually minimize the damage, the impact of the streams, we will issue the permit. Economic impacts, including appropriate taxation, that, as Eileen mentioned, falls under Act 13. Money from the proceeds of natural gas can go to local impact projects, be used to fix roads and other community projects. So there are rules, there are regulations in place, there's different things that the DEP follows, but again, I will reiterate, DEP, we are the agency that tells them whether or not the gas companies can drill or not. So if they want to not follow the rules and the regulations, they're not going to be able to drill. So we look forward to cooperation, we look forward to input from the public. Anything on the DEP website or anything that happens in our interactions with the gas companies, the natural gas compressor stations, is on our website. Public record, you can see how the DEP is issuing the permits, issuing the permits to the gas companies to follow the rules and regulations, and whether or not they're in compliance with those permits. Thank you.
Thank you. Question number 3, I'd like Representative Sandra Major to respond to that also.
Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, laws and regulations, and certainly Colleen addressed it also, but laws and regulations have been in place in Pennsylvania since back in 1956. But with the development of Marcellus Shale, the General Assembly has been proactive in addressing many of the concerns and issues that have been raised regarding gas drilling. Act 127 that we just passed in 2011, also known as the Pennsylvania Gas and Hazardous Liquids Pipeline Act, empowers the Public Utility Commission to enforce safety standards for the design, installation, operation, inspection, testing, construction, extension, replacement, and maintenance of pipeline facilities. In addition to in 2011, the legislature passed Act 13, which is also known as the impact fee. It required review and report of pipeline replacement in Pennsylvania. The report and its recommendations have recently been released, and I and as well as my legislative colleagues have been busy working on how to implement those recommendations. The Pennsylvania Department of Transportation has road posting and bond program whereby they ensure that those that damage our state roads are held responsible for the repair of those state roads. And most townships and municipalities, boroughs and municipalities, where we see the heaviest of truck activity due to the gas drilling, have entered into road maintenance agreements with the industry so that the industry itself fixes and repairs the roads that they damage. Act 13, which I talked a little bit about in its pipeline safety, has provided that fees are collected and distributed to those impacted counties. And let me say, too, that Act 13 is the most comprehensive update of legislative changes in 25 years. And the dollars that go back to those municipalities and the counties, that monies can be used to offset taxes and a long, long list of other uses for their dollars. Act 13 was structured whereby it provides 60% of the fees collected would go to local governments and impacted, and 40% of those dollars would go to the Marcellus Legacy Fund, which those dollars can be used throughout Pennsylvania in such programs such as the Commonwealth Financing Agency, the Environmental Stewardship Fund, water and sewer projects, rehabilitation of our greenway programs, our recreational trails, our open space, and also there's dollars within that 40% that can go to the maintenance of bridges and roads throughout Pennsylvania. Susquehanna County alone, which you heard that I do represent parts of Susquehanna and Wyoming County. Susquehanna County alone, the county received over $3.9 million, which they're using much of that money to offset local taxes. Other dollars went to local municipalities, 40% of those 40 municipalities, and those dollars were received everywhere from $6,000 to $500,000, which $500,000 is the maximum which a township can receive, and 4 specific townships in Susquehanna County have received that money. Wyoming County received a little over $800,000, and 23 municipalities in Wyoming County have received $7,400 up to $491,000. In 2012 alone, $108 million was distributed throughout Pennsylvania, And in 2013, we anticipate that $120 million will be distributed throughout Pennsylvania through the impact fee. Thank you.
Thank you. Also responding to question number 3, Representative Phyllis Lundy, please.
Thank you. Representative Major sort of laid out the question about what regulations. She talked about the 2011 bill and law that became law that passed the PUC with the supervision and regulation of pipeline operators, along with FERC. So I want to talk a little bit about Act 13 and what I believe were some of the deficiencies with Act 13. First of all, I think it opened up new issues that we have to be concerned about. One of those is the physician gag order that prohibits doctors from sharing information about potentially toxic or hazardous chemicals used in fracking with their patients. And this is the subject of a lawsuit. Actually, one of our local physicians, Dr. Al Rodriguez, has a lawsuit pending that would overturn that prohibition. Loss of local control that restricts the rights of local communities to determine how to best regulate drilling activities in their neighborhoods. Actually, this provision was thrown out in Commonwealth Court, but it is being appealed. The provision is currently not being enforced while we wait for the court to decide finally. The impact fee, wholly inadequate in my view, and I'm thrilled for Representative Major's Susquehanna County and the communities that are reaping large benefits. But the fact is that our impact fee amounts to an effective tax rate of 2.6%, less than half of the 5.4% rate in Texas, or the 6% rate in West Virginia. Surely our citizens deserve at least as much as other gas producing states. And another problem, concern I have with Act 13 is that even though it did include environmental buffers and setbacks, which I think, again, are wholly inadequate, their loopholes allow DEP to waive these environmental safeguards, such as setbacks. So those are just some of the concerns that I have about Act 13 and the taxes that it imposes.
Thank you. We do have some time. Would anyone else like to respond to that question? Maybe the other panelists. Okay, we'll move on to question number 4. What is the response, your response to the claim that the industry is outpacing the understanding of environmental impacts of the Marcellus Shale? And I'd like to start that response with Ken Quimo.
All right, so I thought a lot about this one, and I guess my quick answer to this is yes and no. There's a yes and no to this. And so let me give the yes part and let me give the no part to this. So the first thing is that again, I view this as a scientist and also scientist who reads the newspapers and listens to people. And there is really a lot that we don't know about the impacts, environmental impacts, health impacts, economic impacts, and there are a lot of valid concerns that are out there about the impacts. And so some of the concerns, for example, extend to terrestrial. As an ecologist, I look at what I call terrestrial ecosystems, land-based ecosystems. If you drive on Route 29 up to Tunkhannock, you'll see there's a pipeline that's to the right of the road there. That pipeline goes up the mountain, down the mountain, right through the forest. And so there are what we call habitat fragmentation issues. So we're not really sure what the impacts of those are going to be. The impacts of the long-term impact of well pads. What are they going to look like 50, 80, 100 years from now? Are they going to look like strip mines that look like right now? Or are they going to look like farm fields? We really don't know the answer to that at this point. One of the things also we don't know are the impacts to surface water. So are there sedimentation impacts to streams and lakes and wetlands? Are there potential spills that might occur? And in fact, this is one of the things that we're studying at Wilkes. I think, as you know, we have a contract with the Department of Energy to investigate this, and actually we're working very hard. I see a couple of my colleagues actually in the audience here are working diligently on providing these answers, and hopefully we'll have some answers before too long on this. But again, it's an open question in terms of whether there are these impacts. Again, are there impacts to groundwater? Now, everybody talks about groundwater concerns, and you know, to what degree are we having short-term water pollution, long-term water pollution, drinking water, and groundwater? Again, there are questions. Certainly, one of the big questions out there relates to air pollution, and just simply whether particulates are getting in, what are the effects of flaring, but also, more importantly, what are the greenhouse gas emissions that are out there? We know that there's a study that was done by a group of scientists at Cornell that seemed to indicate that shale gas development actually had a bigger greenhouse footprint than coal does. We think, we know coal is a very large footprint, but on the other hand, if you look at the big picture of the other science, there are many other articles that have come out that have refuted the position of those Cornell scientists. And in fact, if you're interested in finding out a little bit more about some of those studies, I actually have over there some handouts we put together, and we actually have an essay on greenhouse gas emissions. So the point then is that we do have a lot that we don't know about Marcellus shale development. And so, well, what do we do? Well, the thing that's interesting is that, in my experience, Marcellus is not alone in this question. Some of you might know, and I know a few people on the panel know, that a few years ago I was involved in a very controversial wind farm project. And the wind farm project ran into some opposition. And the thing that we kept on hearing with this wind project is, you gotta slow down. We don't know what the impacts are on birds. We don't know what the impacts are on bats. We don't know habitat fragmentation issues. We don't know health issues. There's concerns about this. And so there's a lot of concern about wind development, and that we're outpacing our knowledge, and we're deploying too many wind turbines. The same could be said about solar energy. The same could be said about geothermal energy. Certainly the same could be said about nuclear energy. And so we're sitting up here, and we have bright lights that are shining on us. The energy from those lights are probably 50% coal, 30% gas, 20% nuclear. And so where does that energy come from? Because we all demand energy. It goes back to what Brian Orem said, is that we have difficult choices. Every energy has its critics. And so, but we all use energy, so we have to make choices. And so, again, this is the yes and no response. Yes, there's a lot that we don't know about Marcellus and that we have to investigate, but Marcellus is not alone, and we have difficult choices related to energy.
Ken, thank you. I'd also like to respond to question number 4. Eileen Cipriani, please.
Thank you. From my perspective, I believe the industry is outpacing the knowledge of the impacts and the understanding of the impacts of the industry. In preparing for tonight, I looked at a lot of academic research on the gas industry, and although you're able to find a lot about the economic factors, we're very short on research giving the public health perspective and the environmental perspective. There was recently an article in the New York Times, and it talked about academic research at the University of Pennsylvania that's about to get underway. And they're partnering with Columbia, Johns Hopkins, and the University of North Carolina to do a study. And they want to look at the health effects from the fracking process, from pollutions from the gas compressors, and from the flare-offs, from the waste energy. And it was interesting to me because the author of the article went back to the researcher and he said, well, why is it taking so long for this study to come about? And he said, simply it's the lack of funding. So it's a very big cause for concern that the funding for these studies and the studies themselves are so far behind the industry and we're playing catch-up. Only last year, the EPA issued new federal regulations for air pollution rules for fracking wells. So we have to be concerned that our oversight and regulation is behind the industry. And we also have to be concerned is the state properly funding agencies like DEP. I mean, they do a fantastic job for oversight, but are they properly funded? Do they properly have enough staff? So there's some of the concerns that I feel on a local level that need to be addressed.
Thank you. I'd also like to ask William DeRosiers to respond to 4 minutes.
Well, this is where it gets interesting on these panel discussions, because of course I'm going to disagree a little bit with my two colleagues here. I'm going to start with Ken to my left here. He made a couple comments about the impact of these wells over the next 50, 60 years. Will they resemble strip mining? I have a very solid background in strip mining, actually. Grew up in a quarry up in New York State, and I know exactly what the environmental and long-term impacts of strip mining are. You're effectively changing the landscape forever. You're removing a resource from the ground. Natural gas doesn't have that situation. We're not creating strip mines that are 2 football fields wide and 200 feet deep. In fact, our environmental footprint is 1 acre. So everything that I talked about before with these wells producing energy for thousands and thousands of homes, we're actually doing that from less than 1 acre. Granted, when we're developing the wells, we're taking up roughly 10 acres of disturbance, and that can last anywhere between a few months and a couple of years, and we're not going to argue that point. But when we're done and these wells are actually producing, we're done with the drilling and the hydraulic fracturing, we're reducing these pads back and we're reclaiming the land. That land is going to be refertilized, it has its topsoil back, farmers can go back to farming, trees are growing, and all you have to do is look to southwest Pennsylvania, where there are tens of thousands of wells already in Pennsylvania that have been operating for 30, 40, 50, even longer. And I guarantee you, if you do not know what you're looking for, you will not recognize what a natural gas producing well looks like in southwest Pennsylvania. But they're literally everywhere. And the farms are around them, and the communities are growing, and they're fine. Now let's get on to air pollution. That is a concern that everyone has, whether it be climate change or just being able to breathe your air outside when you walk outside. For the first time in 25 years, the carbon footprint in the United States is back to pre-1990 levels. And a large part of that is the increased utilization of natural gas. Natural gas, when it burns, is 40% less carbon emission than when you burn coal. And coal, for the longest time, has dominated our energy sector here. So one of the biggest complaints that we have is this idea that natural gas is somehow more degrading to our overall air quality, yet we have scientific proof showing that the air quality across the country, even in areas where there are heavy development, is improving. And I, for one, am glad for that. There are often concerns about flaring. Now, for those who don't know, flaring is a process that we utilize for a few days to a few weeks after a well is complete to bring the well online. We have fluid in that formation that needs to come up so it does not hinder the overall production of that well. So what we have to do is flow back that water, and during that flow back, you're going to see gas. Traditionally, that gas could be vented, and that's methane, pure methane going up into the atmosphere. And anyone familiar with the science behind climate change and air quality knows that methane is considered a more potent greenhouse gas. So what we do as an industry voluntarily is take a more greener approach and we flare that off. And by flaring off the methane, we essentially create a spark, create a flame in a controlled way, and that gas is now turned into carbon dioxide and actually water vapor. And if you were to do the math of all of the natural gas produced over a well, the life of the well for 60 plus years, you'll realize there's more water, H2O, being produced from that combustion of the natural gas than we have used in creating that well. Ultimately, though, we are moving towards putting that gas directly in the pipelines. And Cabot has, over the last 5 years, on occasion, had the pipeline available or ready to take that gas to market. So we essentially clean up the gas and move it into sales, which we often prefer. And in the essence of time, I think that's everything I'm going to cover here, but maybe we can revisit it at the end of the program.
Thank you. Phyllis, did you also want to respond to that question?
I would, thank you. I thought that Eileen said it well. It seems that we want to do it first and study it later. And the congressional study won't be ready for draft
the draft of it won't be ready for public and peer review until 2014. This New York Times article that was referenced, University of Pennsylvania's Center of Excellence in Environmental Toxicology, that is just now getting underway. The fact is that if the science was clear about the safety of this energy production, then these studies would not be taking place. If the science was clear, then we need further study. And the fact is that New York has had a moratorium for 4 years because they are unconvinced about the safety. Maryland has refused to allow it until it can be proven safe. And we are going gangbusters, full steam ahead on a technology that we cannot be assured is safe. And with all due respect to my colleagues on the panel, to equate solar and wind with this fracking is absolutely... that the industry's claim and the claim of others that we've been doing this for decades and have had no problems, that is simply not true.
Right.
This new technology that has allowed us to drill deeper and fracture and get a hold of this natural gas is relatively new and certainly new in northeastern Pennsylvania.
Would anyone else like to respond to that question?
Yeah, I would just like to add to that, mention, talk about what Phyllis is saying here. What is new, and I mentioned this earlier, is the actual precision of the horizontal drilling process. Hydraulic fracturing has been used in this state for decades. It's nothing new. Bill mentioned there are wells in western Pennsylvania that have been online for decades. The process, the thing that is new here is actually how precise the industry can get. So we're talking about technological advancement. And the other thing that I would point out is that it's really the industry that is helping enhance the science and understanding of the environment in the region. And we as a company have collected roughly 20,000 pre-drilled water tests, data points in the northern PA area, and of those tests, we found that more than 25% of them already have methane presence in them. A very high percentage also have manganese, arsenic, iron. All of these contaminants are naturally there, and it's because of the industry's presence and activity and interest that we're finally talking about these and focusing on them.
Thank you. I think we'll move on at this time to question number 5. Given the uncertainty and the potential risks of this industry, how does one weigh the short and long-term benefits of the natural gas extraction? And we'll start this with Marlene Troy.
I think this kind of summarizes what some of the discussions has been going on this evening, is that how does all this fit together? How can we make these decisions about longer-term, short-term benefits if we don't know what that long-term or big picture is? And I think I was surprised when I was doing some background research for tonight that we do not even have an energy policy. How does all this fit together? Do we have goals for the future? Where do we see ourselves? How are we going to balance these different challenges that we have? Also, we're seeing that we need funding for this money. We need funding for these initiatives. How are we going to get it? Do we have things that exist now? Can we form partnerships? Can we have perhaps public-private partnerships that can work on these problems and come up with situations where we can come up with these, to get the funding to do these studies? One of the challenges is if you need the funding, can you accept money from a gas company and then have your data questioned? So how do we collectively do this and think about the big picture. These are challenges we have to face. We're all here tonight, the weather is very interesting. Is that related to this discussion tonight? Well, is it part of the bigger discussion about climate change? And climate change, very much a component, is where we're getting our energy and thinking about the future and what are we going to do about it. So long-term, short-term, I think it drives the point that we definitely need more discussions about getting an energy policy, seeing how the different components, is gas going to solve everything? No. Is there a potential place for it? Maybe yes, substituting for coal when we make electricity. But can we balance both renewable and these other options going forward and coming up with a plan, coming up with some goals so we can get where we want to be and answer these questions as well?
She's right. She said the word.
Thank you. I'd also like Bernard Prusek to respond to question number 5, please.
Thanks. I want to reiterate my initial comment. I think there are 2 questions that the public needs to know to ask. So just to begin with, again, whether the actors have done enough to dispel the uncertainty over whether fracking poses morally significant risks. Now, if it is the case that we want to do it first and study it later, then the answer's got to be no. And fracking then can't be justifiable. I want to quote Dr. Klimoff. We have a lot that we don't know. There is really a lot that we do not know, and there are a lot of valid concerns. Now, just to focus a little bit on the question that was put to me is, given the uncertainty and the potential risk of this industry, how do we weigh the benefits? You've got to think first, well, how deep does the uncertainty go, and what exactly are we uncertain about? When we talk about the potential risks, what are the risks we're talking about? Are these serious risks to human health? Are these serious risks to, let's say, children? If so, then I'd say that the industry and government really have a very high threshold, again, to meet before fracking could be considered to be morally justifiable. I think that's a point worth reiterating. Questions, though, we've talked about the need for energy policy and the fact that, as Dr. Klimoff put it, we don't know a lot about solar and wind and nuclear energy as well. And there are risks from these two. An important question to consider then, once more, is what sorts of risks we're talking about. So we could acknowledge risks from solar and wind, or are these comparable risks that we'll be talking about when it comes to fracking? So we need clarification on that point, certainly. The second question, again, to reiterate, I think the public needs to know to ask is whether, if there is uncertainty here, and I think there is. I've done a lot of reading. I'm not a scientist, but I've done a lot of reading. I've done a lot of listening to this panel too, hearing a bit of uncertainty. If there is uncertainty about fracking, could we point to moral considerations, substantial moral considerations, in its favor that would justify going ahead? Again, go back to my case of Jill and whether to blow up the house. If she's got moral considerations on her side, she should go ahead. Much more realistic examples would come from war. So sometimes in war, soldiers have to operate in conditions of uncertainty. The question is whether they have substantial moral considerations that would license going ahead and taking a risk that might lead to the death of many innocent persons, let's say. Now, we could point to reduction in carbon and say that could well count as a substantial moral consideration in fracking's favor. We could also perhaps point to geopolitical consequences if, through the exploitation of natural gas, the United States became more energy independent, and perhaps that would have significant political consequences for our relationships with Saudi Arabia and the Middle East more generally. That case, though, has to be made. And so far, I don't know that I've heard it made, quite honestly. So what are the substantial moral considerations that, in conditions of uncertainty, would license our going ahead and running significant moral risks? If the moral risks really are significant to human health and the environment, and if there is uncertainty about these moral risks, then the advocates of fracking, governments and industry, need to point to substantial moral considerations that would justify going ahead. If they don't, they're not making a good ethical argument.
Phyllis, I also have you listed to respond to question number 5. You want to respond to that question?
Oh, sorry. I missed that. I think that's the question. That is the question. How do you weigh the benefits when you don't know what the short and long-term risks really are, because there is not enough good science that lets you know that? Yes, some landowners are reaping enormous benefits. Some new jobs are being created. Natural gas prices are good. Natural gas burns cleaner than coal. But the truth is that we just do not know, and we are not adequately preparing for the short and long-term risks to the environment and to the public health and safety of this new industrial activity.
Anyone else like to respond to that on the panel? No?
I would like to reiterate once again that this term, long-term impacts, short and long-term impacts, define them. Oftentimes they're thrown out as, what are they, 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 years? Well, we have 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 years worth of drilling and hydraulic fracturing in this country. And you made a comment before about how we're drilling deeper. That's actually not the case. The Marcellus Shale is only about 6,000 feet down. You can go down to the Gulf and down to other parts of the world, and we're drilling 10,000, 20,000 feet down. So the technology has existed for us to go down to deeper formations to pull this gas up. The issue is we're focusing on a shale that has not been viable because we didn't have the technology, the computer, the understanding, the price behind it, and the cost. So again, we go back to this notion that what are the long-term benefits or the risks and everything along those lines, and it's been around for so long now. And we have things that we're looking at, carbon reductions, the economics. Montrose, Susquehanna County has a new hospital. A hospital that it's been using for 60, 70 years now is outdated. It's not big enough to accommodate the area, and people have to go almost an hour away to get any quality medical care. Now, because of the industry, there's a brand new hospital that can facilitate any sort of medical care that the industry needs.
It's not built yet, it's not there.
It's a mound of dirt.
Mound of dirt.
Comments, please. You can talk afterwards.
But he's lying.
Another point often debated is the ancillary effects of the economy. Adam Diaz, for instance, is a 35-year-old entrepreneur in Susquehanna County who went to school for graphic design. And if you're familiar with Susquehanna County, there isn't much need for graphic designers. So he ended up going back into bluestone quarrying. And when the industry came into town, he saw that as an opportunity to expand. And what he did was he started delivering the garbage containers on site. And then he started delivering the crushed stone. And then he started buying the trucks and eventually a quarry to bring the stone. So now he's fully integrated. He eventually moved on to drilling the first 100 feet of our wells. He realized that the industry could be more efficient if it had a new mechanism to accomplish that. But perhaps the most interesting part of his story is the cabinet manufacturing plant that he bought that went out of business, and with it, 30 jobs. Adam bought that, reinvested money into it so that it could compete in the cabinet manufacturing market, and now there's 30 people with health insurance, with extra money in their pockets so their kids can go to school and have a good time. And that's a direct impact from natural gas, and that's a sustainable impact from natural gas, because that is a product that's not dependent upon natural gas, but yet there's people directly benefiting from it. And this is just one example of the many that I can give. And I'm just going to pass this on to somebody else now.
That's the
Thank you.
only one.
Thank you.
Right.
Okay, let's go to question number 6, the last question now. In what ways has the discussion changed concerning Marcellus shale exploration. How can local residents, students, and others remain sufficiently informed and participate in the public discussion about this industry? And we'll start the response with Ken Klingel.
Okay. So I guess the answer to this, how has the discussion changed? And I guess the answer depends upon your time frame. And so, if you go back to 2005, 2006, how many of us even knew about Marcellus Shale? How many cared about Marcellus Shale? How many people cared about hydrofracking? And the answer is not many. We were worried about other things back in 2005, 2006. If you fast forward to 2008, 2009, when hydrofracking first came on board, one of the things that I saw, and again, I'm interested in science, but I'm also very interested in the public understanding of science and trying to see if we can raise scientific literacy and use science for better decision making. And one of the things that I saw, and maybe I was sensitized to this because, again, of the experiences that I went through on this wind farm project back in 2005, 2006, is how quickly people developed an opinion on this. You had industry that very quickly developed, and they got very defensive, and they were very, first of all, they were very proud about what they did, but then they were very defensive about criticism that came their way. And on the other hand, there was an opposition that developed very quickly to this issue, and this opposition really took no, they didn't spare any negative comments against industry. So what we had then was this really divisive, nasty, personal argument that developed between industry proponents and industry opponents. And so, again, as I saw this happen 2008, 2009, maybe 2010. And so what I see, and I think this is typified by what we're seeing tonight in this audience, is that this division still occurs. That we have proponents of gas development, industry, and other people who are benefiting, but also people who might be free market advocates and people who don't like environmental regulation. So we have people who just think, let's let the gas industry proceed with either unfettered or just with what the DEP is doing now. On the other hand, we have people who are bitterly opposed to gas development. And it's really, to a large extent, the same people who were bitterly opposed a few years ago. And so the thing that I see interesting happening, though, as my position as a scientist, is that one of the things that I'm seeing happen in this discussion is that people are now actually paying attention to the science. Unlike what might have happened maybe 5 or 10 or 15 years ago, a lot of the discussion that we have now are people arguing about scientific articles. And from my perspective, this is great. That we're arguing science. People are going and reading the Graffian and Howard articles, and they're reading the Catholic articles, and they're reading, they all know who, some of the Duke researchers are. And so this is really wonderful. But the thing that I see, though, is that there's a lot of misuse of the science. So people are taking the science and they're twisting it, they're cherry picking it to suit their own purpose. And we have to stop doing that. We have to be open-minded. We're all in this together. We have tough choices as a society, and we can't go just simply pointing fingers and insulting people and clapping for one group of people and clapping for another group of people. We have to engage in thoughtful, productive discussion, and we need to find some way of getting consensus. So maybe if we fast forward the discussion, what I'd like to see 3 years from now, 5 years from now, are the opponents and the proponents getting together and finding ways to be able to, be able to come to a rational decision on this, and not just have this bitter back and forth that's going on.
Thank you. Let me also ask Berta Prusek to respond to question number 6.
Well, that was a good response, I thought. I can't say much to the first part of this question, how has the discussion changed? I can speak a little bit to the second part of it, which is how can local residents, students, and others remain sufficiently informed and participate in public discussion about this industry. And my brief answer will be that it's very difficult to do, it seems to me. Very difficult to be well-informed and to sift your way through the arguments on different sides. I just read a good document put out by the International Energy Agency, and I would recommend that. I would say, though, secondly here, Dr. Klimo, to speak with scientists and try to learn more about what the current possibilities are for this sort of extraction. I think asking questions too is critical, so it's very good to know about best practices in the industry. We also want to know whether best practices are always being put into place. I'm glad to hear from the representatives that they are. It makes me a little bit uneasy to think that we rely so much on self-reporting, and I'd like it to be the case that disclosure of chemical additives were entirely mandatory and not voluntary. In fact, I find it baffling that it's still voluntary. It's my understanding. So, for one, it's quite difficult to keep informed. I'd say keep talking to scientists, while also reading the New York Times. I want to say something a little bit about a comment that Brian made to me, or a comment Brian made earlier too. And this discussion's got to take place within the context of discussion about energy policy more generally. So we need our energy from somewhere, and various forms of energy we do have various adverse consequences. So whether we're talking about coal or nuclear, so on and so forth. So we really have to think about, well, we need this energy. What's the best course of action going forward? What's the technology? What's the source of this energy that poses the least morally significant risks that we can identify?
Thank you. Representative Sanders, you also respond to question number 6.
Thank you. Indeed, this discussion has come a long way. It has evolved over the past few years. Early on, the concerns that I heard from a legislative perspective certainly related to leases, to royalties, and to other land issues. And as the industry began to grow and Pennsylvania became more familiar with Marcellus Shale and the natural gas production, the discussion shifted more towards regulation and taxes or impact fees. And while we all need to be vigilant in regulating, that certainly will always be very important. Today we are indeed seeing more interest in expanding the natural gas service so that we can see it developed in our homes and our businesses throughout the Commonwealth. We're seeing CNG stations pop up around northeastern Pennsylvania so that we can use natural gas in our vehicles, and we're seeing more production of natural gas vehicles popping up. Procter & Gamble, which is a very large employer in this area, its warehouse uses all their transport trucks that go from their main plant up to their warehouse are now all natural gas vehicles. And you did hear a reference earlier to a hospital that's being built in Susquehanna County that too will be using natural gas. So also in Susquehanna County, we have a company that has agreed, they have an application that they've submitted to the PUC, and they will be developing natural gas. They'll be going into the Montrose, New Milford, and Great Bend and surrounding communities whereby homes and businesses in those communities can use natural gas. So we're seeing more and more of that, and certainly that's where the conversations tend to be leaning. As far as keeping people educated, I do believe that forums such as this tonight are extremely important, and your attendance here tonight is good. Whether you support or whether you oppose the industry, you are here tonight to gather information. There's websites, DEP has a website, the PUC has a website, Penn State Cooperative Extension has very good information on their website, and indeed we've heard that Wilkes University is doing a study and is very proactive in developing information about Marcellus Shale. So I do believe that as the conversations are ongoing, certainly we need to be proactive in gathering information. And you saw me earlier clap for Dr. Klimo, because from the legislative perspective, I do believe that it's all about balance. It's about balancing a natural resource that we've had that has existed in Pennsylvania for many, many years, and whereby we've learned we've developed a technology whereby to develop it, and I believe it's about finding the balance where that technology can move forward to provide jobs and resources for our homes and for our businesses. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, just about right on time. This concludes our discussion this evening. I want to thank the audience for your attention. I particularly want to thank all of our panelists for your comments tonight. Thank you very much. I want to thank the organizer of this event, Mrs. Rachel Bartron. Thank you. I hope everyone here tonight is a little better informed on all sides of these complex issues. But clearly, this isn't going to teach you everything you need to know, because we need to understand a lot in trying to solve the complex issues. And I just say good luck to all of us as we move forward. Thank you. Have a good evening.